In the heart of Illinois, 9 miles south of Chicago, stood a town unlike any other in America, the town of Pullman, built between 1880 and 1884. 4,000 acres of perfectly planned streets and brick row houses, 1,200 buildings constructed in matching Queen Anne style with pressed red brick and slate roofs. The most advanced company town in the world, housing 12,600 residents in homes with running water, gas lighting, and indoor plumbing. They called it a workers' paradise, a model community that would solve the labor problem plaguing industrial America. But beneath this architectural perfection hid another story, a story of workers who paid rent to sleep, paid again to eat, and found their paychecks reduced to pennies after their employer deducted the cost of existing. A story of a sleeping car magnate who believed he could own not just his workers' labor, but their entire lives. This paradise was not built on goodwill. It rose on a philosophy that would spark the deadliest labor war in American history, a conflict that would leave 30 dead, destroy $80 million in property, and force the Supreme Court to define the limits of corporate power over workers. The Civil War ended in 1865. American industry exploded in the decades that followed, with innovations that transformed how people lived and traveled. Railroads stretched across the continent, connecting cities that had been weeks apart by wagon. The first transcontinental railroad was completed in 1869, when the Union Pacific and Central Pacific met at Promontory Summit in Utah. By 1870, you could travel from New York to San Francisco in less than a week, a journey that had taken months by wagon train just years earlier. But that journey was brutal. Passenger cars were basically wooden boxes on wheels mounted on iron frames. Hard bench seats made from wooden slats. No heat in winter beyond cast iron stoves that roasted passengers near them while others froze. No cooling in summer when temperatures inside cars could reach over 100 degrees. Windows that admitted dust, cinders, and smoke from the locomotive. Sleeping meant curling up on your seat or sprawling on the floor with your coat as a pillow. The wealthy could afford private compartments on certain routes, small enclosed spaces with slightly padded benches, but even these offered minimal comfort. For a journey from Chicago to San Francisco, passengers spent 7 days and nights in these conditions. They ate at station stops during brief layovers, often consuming food that had been sitting for hours. Sanitation was primitive. Toilets consisted of holes opening directly onto the tracks. Washing facilities meant a single basin and pitcher shared by an entire car. Women traveling alone faced particular hardships. There were no private changing areas, no security, no protection from harassment by male passengers or railroad employees. The experience was so miserable that many people chose not to travel at all. Business that required cross-country trips was conducted through letters that took weeks. Families separated by migration might not see each other for years or decades. The railroad had conquered distance in theory, but the physical reality of rail travel remained medieval. Engineers had solved the problem of moving people quickly across vast distances. No one had solved the problem of making that movement bearable. Railroads themselves had little incentive to improve passenger comfort. Their real profits came from freight. Moving grain, livestock, manufactured goods, raw materials generated far more revenue than passenger fares. Passenger service existed mainly to fulfill charter requirements and maintain political support. As long as passengers tolerated the conditions, railroads saw no reason to invest in comfort. But here's the thing about miserable experiences. They create opportunities for anyone who can solve the misery. Passengers desperate for comfort would pay premium fares. Railroads that could offer superior service would attract the most profitable travelers, wealthy business executives, and prosperous families. The market existed. The technology existed. What was needed was someone willing to invest the capital and effort to transform railroad sleeping cars from instruments of torture into something approaching comfort. One man saw that opportunity with perfect clarity. One man understood that luxury rail travel could make him one of the wealthiest industrialists in America. George Mortimer Pullman was born in 1831 in Brockton, New York, a small town in the western part of the state. His father, James Pullman, was a carpenter and mechanic who moved the family frequently seeking work. George learned construction trades from his father, skills that emphasized precision and problem-solving. By his early 20s, Pullman had moved to Chicago and established himself in an unusual specialty. He relocated buildings. Chicago in the 1850s faced a unique infrastructure problem. The city had been built on swampy ground near Lake Michigan. Streets frequently flooded. Disease spread through contaminated water. City officials decided to raise street levels by 4 to 14 feet to improve drainage. This means every building along the new street grades had to be lifted and new foundations constructed underneath. The work required engineering precision. Lift too fast and buildings cracked. Lift unevenly and they collapsed. Pullman developed systems using hundreds of jack screws operated by teams of men turning them in perfect synchronization. The most famous project came in 1860 when Pullman's company lifted the Tremont House, a brick hotel on Lake Street. The building measured 180 feet by 100 feet and stood 5 stories tall, weighing thousands of tons. Pullman placed 1,200 jack screws under the foundation. He hired 1,200 men, 1 per jack screw. On his signal, they all turned their screws 1/4 turn. Then they paused. Then another quarter turn. Over several days, they raised the entire building 4 feet without cracking a single pane of glass. Guests remained in their rooms during the lift. The hotel restaurant continued serving meals. The project earned Pullman $20,000, approximately $600,000 in modern money, and established his reputation as an engineer who could accomplish the supposedly impossible. But Pullman's ambition exceeded construction. In 1858, he took a trip from Buffalo to Westfield, New York, a journey of about 60 miles. The overnight trip required a sleeper car. Pullman later described the experience as torturous. The so-called sleeping berths were wooden shelves with thin mattresses. They were stacked 3 high with minimal space between. Passengers climbed ladders to reach upper berths. Privacy didn't exist. Curtains separating berths were flimsy. The car was filthy. The air was stale. Pullman spent the night imagining something completely different. He envisioned railroad cars transformed into mobile hotels, seats that converted into comfortable beds, polished wood paneling instead of bare boards, velvet upholstery instead of hard wooden benches, ornate fixtures and chandeliers, proper mattresses and linens changed daily by uniformed staff. Pullman understood that wealthy travelers would pay premium fares for such comfort, and that railroads would profit from the revenue those travelers generated. More importantly, he understood that controlling both the manufacture of luxury cars and the service provided inside them would create a business model where he owned the entire experience. In 1863, Pullman partnered with Benjamin Field, a friend from his building moving days. They raised $40,000 in capital, approximately $1.2 million in modern money. They purchased a used Chicago and Alton Railroad coach and completely rebuilt it to Pullman's specifications. The transformation took them nearly a year working in a shed on Chicago's lakefront. The car they created was named Pioneer. It measured 54 feet long and 10 feet wide, significantly larger than standard passenger cars of the era, which averaged 40 to 45 feet long and 8 feet wide. The extra size wasn't wasteful. It was essential to Pullman's design. Inside, he installed an innovative folding berth system. Upper berths were pulled down from hinged panels in the ceiling. Lower berths were converted from facing seats that slid together. Each berth had a proper mattress filled with horsehair, cotton batting, and springs. Fresh linen sheets and wool blankets were provided. Thick curtains offered privacy. The materials were expensive. Black walnut paneling covered the walls, hand-rubbed to a deep luster. The wood came from trees in the upper Midwest, selected for grain pattern and color. Carpets made from Brussels weave wool covered the floors in rich reds and golds. Seats were upholstered in green velvet. Ornate gas chandeliers hung from elaborately plastered ceilings decorated with gold leaf. French plate-glass windows, much larger than standard car windows, were set in carved frames. Silver-plated hardware, custom hinges, and polished brass fixtures completed the interior. Every detail suggested wealth and permanence. The car cost $20,000 to build, 4 times the cost of standard sleeper cars, which could be constructed for $4,000 to $5,000. Railroads initially refused to use Pioneer because the car was too wide for station platforms and too tall for bridge clearances. Allowing it to run would require modifying infrastructure along entire routes, an expensive proposition railroads weren't willing to undertake for a single experimental car. Pullman needed a spectacular demonstration. That opportunity came in April 1865 when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Mary Todd Lincoln requested that Pioneer be included in the funeral train carrying the president's body from Chicago to Springfield, Illinois. Railroads along the route hastily modified platforms and raised bridge clearances to accommodate the oversized car. After the funeral, they realized those modifications now allowed Pioneer and similar cars to run regularly. The investment had been made, and Pullman's business model could proceed. He didn't want to sell cars to railroads, he wanted to lease them. Pullman would retain ownership of every car. Railroads would pay per mile traveled. Passengers would pay supplements above standard fare to use the cars. This model meant Pullman controlled quality, service, staffing, and maintenance. Railroads simply provided the tracks and locomotives. The revenue split favored Pullman. For every dollar a passenger paid in supplement, Pullman kept 75 cents. The railroad got 25 cents. In 1867, Pullman partnered with Andrew Carnegie and others to form the Pullman Palace Car Company with capital of $1 million, approximately $20 million in modern terms. The company would manufacture luxury sleeping cars, dining cars, and parlor cars. Production began at a facility on the Calumet River in Chicago. By 1870, Pullman was operating 48 cars on multiple railroad lines. By 1875, the fleet exceeded 200 cars. By 1880, over 500 cars were in service. Revenue grew exponentially. In 1870, gross receipts totaled $200,000. By 1880, annual revenue reached $6 million, approximately $150 million in modern money. Pullman became one of America's wealthiest industrialists. His cars set the standard for luxury rail travel worldwide. European railroads ordered Pullman cars. Asian railroads licensed his designs. The name Pullman became synonymous with comfortable travel. But here's the thing about Pullman's success. It depended entirely on service that matched the luxury. Passengers paying premium fares expected perfection. That meant spotless cars, perfectly made beds, impeccable dining service, and crews trained to anticipate every need. Pullman hired thousands of porters, almost exclusively black men, who worked brutal hours for low wages, supplemented by tips. The porters made Pullman cars function. Robert Turner was one of them. He had been hired in 1878 at age 22. He had been born enslaved in Virginia and had come north after emancipation seeking opportunity. The porter position was the best job he could hope for. He worked the Chicago to New York run, a prestigious route that attracted wealthy passengers and hopefully generous tips. Robert Turner's typical shift began at 6 in the evening when passengers boarded. He greeted each one by name, having memorized the passenger list. He carried luggage to berths, pointing out the washroom and explaining how the folding beds worked. By 8, he was serving drinks from the bar car. At 9:30, he began converting the first berths for elderly passengers who retired early. Each berth took 3 minutes to prepare. Pull down the upper berth, slide the lower seats together, fit the mattress, tuck in the sheets, arrange the blankets, hang fresh curtains. 40 berths meant 2 hours of continuous work while passengers milled about. At midnight, he cleaned the washroom and polished brass fixtures. At 1 in the morning, he ironed a businessman's suit that needed to be ready for an early meeting. At 2, he responded to call buttons. One passenger wanted ice water. Another needed help adjusting the curtain. A third complained the berth was too warm. At 3, he dozed in the porter compartment, a space 3 feet by 6 feet with no mattress, just a bench. At 5, a call button woke him. At 5:30, he began converting berths back to seats before passengers woke. At 7, he served coffee and breakfast pastries. His shift ended at noon when the train reached New York, 18 hours after it began. He had earned 90 cents, approximately $27 in modern money, plus whatever tips passengers provided. The porters, men like Robert Turner, converted seats to berths at night and berths back to seats in the morning. They served meals in dining cars. They shined shoes and pressed clothes. They carried luggage. They cleaned cars between runs. They endured racist treatment from white passengers who called them all George, regardless of their actual names, as if they were property of George Pullman himself. Porter wages averaged $27.50 per month in the 1880s, approximately $850 in modern money. But porters worked 400 hours per month, sometimes more, earning about 7 cents per hour. They paid for their own uniforms, shoe polish, and supplies. They slept in cramped porter quarters or in berths between runs. Shifts could last 20 hours. Porters were expected to be available whenever passengers needed anything, which meant they rarely got uninterrupted sleep. The job security was non-existent. Pullman could fire porters without cause. Complaints about working conditions resulted in immediate dismissal. Porters who attempted to organize faced blacklisting from the entire industry. Yet thousands of black men sought porter positions because the alternatives were worse. In an era of Jim Crow segregation, porter jobs offered steady employment, travel opportunities, and higher status within black communities than agricultural or domestic labor. Passengers tipped porters for good service, and those tips often exceeded base wages. A porter who provided exceptional service might earn $50 to $100 monthly in tips, tripling his income. Robert Turner was skilled at reading passengers. He knew which ones wanted conversation and which wanted silence. He knew when to offer a drink and when to disappear. On good runs, he earned $70 in tips. On bad runs, $20. The unpredictability made planning impossible. But tips were unpredictable and depended entirely on passenger generosity and the porter's ability to endure humiliation with a smile. Pullman counted tips as part of compensation, which justified paying minimal base wages. The system exploited both porters and passengers. Porters worked for inadequate wages. Passengers were expected to subsidize those wages through tips. The porter system created the service quality that made Pullman cars famous, but it also created a workforce with deep grievances. Porters understood they were essential to Pullman's business, yet were treated as disposable. They generated millions in revenue, yet lived in poverty. They maintained the luxury that made Pullman wealthy, yet owned nothing themselves. The contradiction would eventually explode into labor activism, but in the 1870s, Pullman felt secure. Racial discrimination meant porters had few employment alternatives and no political power. By the late 1870s, Pullman faced two problems. First, a manufacturing problem. His Chicago factory was too small for growing demand. Orders were backlogged. Railroads wanted more cars faster. Pullman needed a massive facility capable of producing rail cars at industrial scale. Second, a philosophical problem. The 1877 railroad strikes had terrified American industrialists. Workers had rioted across the country. They burned railroad property in Pittsburgh. They shut down rail traffic for weeks. Federal troops were deployed to restore order. Over 100 people died in the violence. Pullman believed the solution was not higher wages or better conditions. The solution was total environmental control. If he could control where workers lived, what they ate, and how they spent their time, he could prevent labor unrest entirely. Workers in company housing would be dependent on company goodwill. They would not strike if striking meant losing their homes. They would not organize if organizing meant eviction. This was not just about building a factory. It was about building a social experiment that would solve the labor problem plaguing industrial America. In 1880, Pullman purchased 4,000 acres of land 9 miles south of Chicago along Lake Calumet. The location offered everything he needed: railroad connections via the Illinois Central Line, deep water access for shipping raw materials and finished cars, distance from Chicago's radical labor organizers who were concentrated in the city's industrial neighborhoods, and open prairie land where he could build exactly what he envisioned without constraints from existing development. The price for the land was $800,000, approximately $24 million in modern money. Pullman hired architect Solon Spencer Beeman, who had designed Pullman's mansion on Prairie Avenue in Chicago, and landscape architect Nathan Barrett, who had worked on parks in New York. The instructions were specific: design a complete town that would house 12,000 workers and their families, make it beautiful, make it controlled, and make it profitable. Construction began in 1880 and continued through 1884. The total investment reached $8 million, approximately $240 million in modern money. This wasn't just factory construction, it was creating an entire municipality from scratch. Pullman built everything a town required, and he owned all of it. 1,200 brick row houses were arranged on a precise grid of streets. Each house was built in Queen Anne Revival architectural style with pressed red brick, slate roofs, and decorative woodwork. The smallest units contained 2 rooms and rented for $8 monthly. The largest houses had 5 bedrooms with parlors and rented for $18 monthly. All houses had running water piped from the company's water system, gas lighting from the company's gas works, and indoor plumbing with flush toilets, luxuries that were rare in working-class housing anywhere in America. The construction quality was genuinely superior. Bricks were made on site from clay excavated during foundation work. Each brick was pressed in molds to ensure uniform size and then fired in kilns to specifications that exceeded standard construction bricks. Walls were 2 bricks thick for insulation and stability. Roofs used slate imported from Vermont, a material that would last decades longer than wooden shingles. Foundation work included drainage systems to prevent flooding. Streets were macadamized with crushed stone and graded for proper water runoff. The town's centerpiece was the Arcade Building, a massive structure that filled an entire block. The building was 3 stories tall, constructed from red brick with ornate terracotta details and large arched windows. Inside, the first floor housed a market hall with stalls for butchers, bakers, and produce vendors. The second floor contained shops selling dry goods, clothing, and household items. The third floor held offices and meeting rooms. At one end of the building was a theater seating 1,000 people with a proscenium stage, orchestra pit, and balcony. At the other end was a library holding 8,000 volumes, though workers had to pay membership fees to use it. Pullman built a church, a Gothic revival structure with a soaring spire, though workers had to pay pew rents to attend services. He built a school system with modern classrooms and equipment, parks with fountains and flower beds maintained by company gardeners, playgrounds for children, stables for horses, and a hotel called the Hotel Florence, named after his daughter, Florence Pullman. The hotel had 50 rooms offering luxury accommodations for visitors and company executives. The hotel's bar was the only place in town where alcohol could be purchased. The manufacturing complex occupied 600 acres adjacent to the residential town. The main erecting shop covered 11 acres under one roof. The building was 40 feet tall with brick walls and a sawtooth roof design that allowed natural light to flood the interior through north-facing skylights. Inside the erecting shop, workers assembled sleeping cars, dining cars, and parlor cars from raw materials to finished products. Separate buildings housed specialized operations. The woodworking shop employed carpenters who cut and shaped lumber using steam-powered saws and planers. The upholstery shop had dozens of workers cutting fabric and stuffing cushions. The paint shop applied dozens of coats of varnish and lacquer, sanding between each coat to achieve mirror-smooth finishes. The iron foundry cast wheel sets, axles, and structural components. The machine shop built custom hardware and mechanical systems. The facility employed specialized craftsmen from around the world. German woodcarvers created the ornate paneling that decorated luxury cars. They worked with chisels and gouges, carving intricate patterns into black walnut and mahogany. French polishers applied finishes that required weeks of work per car. They used techniques involving shellac dissolved in alcohol, rubbed on with cloth pads in circular motions, building up layers until the wood glowed with depth. Italian marble cutters installed floors and decorative elements in dining cars. Russian metalworkers forged decorative brass and bronze fixtures. By 1893, the factory employed 12,500 workers. Thomas Heathcote was one of them. He had arrived in 1882 from Scotland, a skilled carpenter who had learned his trade in Glasgow shipyards. He had heard about Pullman's new factory and the promise of steady work in a modern town. He moved his family into a 4-room house on Fulton Street. The house had conveniences his family had never experienced: running water, a flush toilet, gas lights in every room. His wife, Margaret, marveled at the kitchen with its porcelain sink and coal stove with a water reservoir. Their 3 children had a bedroom separate from their parents, luxury they had never known in Glasgow. Thomas earned $60 monthly as a skilled carpenter in 1890. The rent was $18. Groceries from the company store cost about $20 monthly for a family of 5. Coal and gas added another $8. That left $14 for everything else: clothing, medicine, savings. It was tight but manageable. Thomas was building sleeping cars that would be used by millionaires. The irony wasn't lost on him, but the work was steady, and the town was clean, and his children attended good schools. Annual production exceeded 750 rail cars. The company's stock valuation reached $62 million, approximately $2 billion in modern value. The Pullman Palace Car Company controlled 75% of the luxury sleeper car market in North America. The factory could produce complete cars in weeks, a process that had previously taken months. Efficiency innovations included assembly line organization, specialized workstations, and centralized materials handling. The town's infrastructure supported the factory operations. The water system pumped water from artesian wells, treating it in a filtration plant before distributing it through underground pipes to both the factory and residential areas. The gas works manufactured illuminating gas from coal, storing it in large holders and distributing it through mains. The company built its own power plant to generate electricity for factory machinery. A sewage system collected waste and treated it in settling ponds before releasing it into the Calumet River. Everything appeared ideal. Contemporary observers praised the town as a worker's paradise. Visitors toured the clean streets lined with identical brick houses and admired the architectural coherence. Articles in Harper's Weekly, Scribner's Magazine, and other national publications celebrated Pullman's enlightened paternalism. The town won awards at international expositions. Delegations from Europe visited to study the model. Reformers pointed to Pullman as proof that capitalism and worker welfare could coexist. Business leaders saw it as the solution to labor unrest. If every factory provided housing this good, workers would have no reason to strike. But beneath this surface perfection, the 12,500 workers understood a darker truth. They didn't live in paradise. They lived in a company store expanded to the scale of an entire town. Every aspect of their lives was controlled, monitored, and monetized by the man who employed them. The beautiful brick houses came with a price that went far beyond monthly rent. The price was freedom itself. Here's how it worked. Workers rented their homes from the Pullman Company. Rent averaged $12 to $18 monthly, depending on house size, approximately 25 to 30% of typical wages for skilled workers. That was significantly high than comparable housing in surrounding communities like Roseland or Kensington, where similar houses rented for $8 to $12 monthly. Pullman defended the rates by citing superior construction and amenities, the running water and gas lighting, and indoor plumbing that other working-class housing lacked. But workers had no alternatives. Company policy prohibited employees from living outside the town if housing was available. Leases prohibited subletting and could be terminated with 10 days' notice for any reason or no reason at all. Workers purchased necessities at company-owned stores in the Arcade Building. Prices averaged 20 to 25% higher than comparable goods in Chicago shops 9 miles away. A pound of flour cost 6 cents in Pullman versus 4 cents in Chicago. A dozen eggs cost 18 cents versus 14 cents. A pound of beef cost 15 cents versus 12 cents. Over a month, those differences added up to several dollars, a significant amount when total wages were $40 to $60 monthly. Workers who attempted to shop in Chicago faced practical obstacles. The trip required time and transportation costs. Many workers lacked the ability to carry enough supplies to make the journey worthwhile. The company discouraged Chicago shopping through social pressure and threats of reduced hours. The company deducted rent, utility costs, and store debts directly from paychecks before workers received them. The payroll office calculated earnings, subtracted all amounts owed to the company, and issued checks for the remainder. Many workers received paychecks showing they'd earned $30 to $40 but netted $6 to $10 after deductions. Some paychecks showed balances of pennies. A few showed negative balances, meaning workers owed the company money and would have to work the next pay period just to break even. Thomas Heathcote understood the system better than most. In 1890, his gross monthly earnings were $60. The paycheck showed the calculation: $60 earned, minus $18 rent, minus $22 charged at the company store for flour, meat, vegetables, coal, lamp oil, and clothing his wife had purchased on credit throughout the month, minus $7 for gas and water. That left $13 to hold in his hand. $13 from $60 earned. In months when unexpected expenses arose, a child's medicine or a needed winter coat, Margaret charged them at the company store, and Thomas's next paycheck showed even less. The company always got its money first. Workers borrowed from relatives to cover gaps. They delayed purchasing necessities. They sent children to work in the factory as soon as legally possible to increase family income. Families went hungry while living in houses nicer than anything their parents had ever known. The contradiction was intentional. Pullman wanted workers comfortable enough to appreciate what they had, but dependent enough to never challenge his authority. The company controlled every aspect of life beyond work and rent. The hotel bar was the only place in town serving alcohol, and management decided who could drink there. Workers perceived as troublemakers found themselves denied service. The library charged membership fees of $3 annually, too expensive for most workers. The church required pew rents of $1 to $3 monthly, depending on location. Parks were maintained beautifully, but workers couldn't organize gatherings without permission from company administrators. Pullman employed inspectors who visited homes without notice to ensure cleanliness standards were maintained. Violations could result in warnings, fines, or eviction. Workers who joined unions or participated in labor organizing found their leases terminated within days. The company maintained lists of agitators. Those workers were fired and evicted, often finding themselves blacklisted throughout the railroad industry. The town had no elected government. Pullman appointed all officials. There were no town meetings, no public forums, no democratic participation of any kind. Workers lived in a benevolent dictatorship where the dictator controlled their income, their housing, their food, and their freedom of movement and association. Some workers spoke favorably about the town. The housing quality exceeded what they could afford elsewhere. The streets were safe and clean. Schools were better than most working-class neighborhoods offered. Children had playgrounds. But most workers resented the lack of autonomy. They wanted to choose their own housing. They wanted to shop where prices were reasonable. They wanted to drink at taverns that didn't report their behavior to their employer. They wanted basic freedoms that Pullman considered threats to his perfect community. Then came 1893. The World's Columbian Exposition opened in Chicago that summer, celebrating the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas. 27 million visitors attended over 6 months. The event showcased American industrial progress and cultural achievement. George Pullman served on the exposition's board of directors. Pullman cars transported dignitaries and wealthy visitors. The Pullman exhibit displayed luxury rail cars in all their gilded glory, demonstrating American craftsmanship to the world. But while the exposition dazzled visitors with electric lights and moving sidewalks, the American economy was collapsing. The Panic of 1893 began in May when the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad declared bankruptcy with debts of $125 million. Stock prices plummeted on the New York Stock Exchange. Investors panicked and withdrew money from banks. Banks failed when they couldn't meet withdrawal demands. Within months, over 600 banks had collapsed. 15,000 businesses declared bankruptcy. 4 million workers lost their jobs. Unemployment reached over 18% nationally and higher in industrial cities. The Depression would last 4 years and became the worst economic crisis America had yet experienced. Railroads suffered catastrophically because they'd overexpanded during the boom years of the 1880s. They'd borrowed heavily to build new lines. When traffic declined and revenue evaporated, they couldn't service their debts. By the end of 1893, 192 railroads controlling 40,000 miles of track were in receivership or bankruptcy. These railroads canceled orders for new cars. Existing cars sat idle in rail yards. Maintenance was deferred. The Pullman Palace Car Company's order book emptied virtually overnight. By winter of 1893, Pullman faced a choice. He could reduce production and lay off workers entirely, or he could keep the factory operating at reduced capacity while cutting costs dramatically. Pullman chose cost-cutting. He believed maintaining some production would preserve the workforce's skills and position the company to capitalize when the economy recovered, but the cuts would be severe. In September 1893, Pullman cut wages across the entire workforce. Skilled machinists earning $3 daily, approximately $90 in modern money, saw their pay reduced to $2.25. Semi-skilled workers who had earned $2 daily dropped to $1.40. Unskilled laborers went from $1.50 to $1. Some specialized positions faced cuts exceeding 40%. By spring of 1894, average wages had fallen 25 to 40% from 1893 levels, depending on job classification. Thomas Heathcote's daily wage dropped from $2.50 to $1.75. His monthly earnings fell from $60 to $42. The cut happened in October 1893. His first reduced paycheck arrived in November. It showed $42 earned, minus $18 rent, unchanged. Minus $20 at the company store, barely reduced because his family still needed to eat. Minus $7 for gas and water, unchanged. The net amount was negative $3. He owed the company money. His next paycheck would start $3 in debt. But here's what Pullman didn't cut. He didn't reduce rents. He didn't lower utility rates. He didn't decrease prices at company stores. He didn't reduce dividends to shareholders. Rents remained at $12 to $18 monthly for houses. Store prices stayed 20 to 25% above Chicago rates. The company's gas works continued charging premium rates for lighting and heating. Water service fees remained unchanged. In August 1893, the Pullman Company Board voted to maintain dividend payments of 2% quarterly, 8% annually, to shareholders. Pullman's personal spending on his Prairie Avenue mansion in Chicago and his vast summer estate in New Jersey continued without any reduction. Workers found their economic situation catastrophic. A skilled worker who had earned $60 monthly in 1892 now earned $40 in 1894, but still paid $18 rent plus $10 for utilities and groceries at the company store. After deductions, that worker received a paycheck for $12 to support a family. Semi-skilled workers who had earned $48 monthly now earned $30, but still paid the same rent and store costs. Their paychecks showed $2 to $6 after deductions. Unskilled workers sometimes received paychecks for pennies. A few paychecks showed negative balances, meaning workers owed the company money and had worked the entire pay period for nothing. Families borrowed from relatives in Chicago. They delayed purchasing food and fuel. Children went to bed hungry in houses with gas and plumbing, while their father had built the luxury rail cars that made George Pullman one of the wealthiest men in America. Workers understood the mathematics were deliberately cruel. Pullman could have reduced rents proportionally to wage cuts. If wages fell 30%, rents could fall 30%. Instead, Pullman maintained every source of income from workers while slashing their ability to pay. The company was extracting maximum value from a captive workforce. Workers couldn't move because they lacked savings. They couldn't organize because they'd be evicted. They were trapped in a system designed to keep them dependent and powerless. In March 1894, a delegation of workers requested a meeting with George Pullman. The delegation included Thomas Heathcote, who had worked at the factory for 12 years. It included Jenny Curtis, a 19-year-old seamstress who worked in the upholstery department stitching velvet cushions for dining cars. Jenny's father had died in March. Her mother was sick with pneumonia. Her younger sister had been fired for trying to organize a women's grievance committee. Jenny was supporting her mother and 3 younger siblings on wages of $6 per week, down from $9 the year before. After rent and store deductions, she netted about $8 per month for a family of 5. The delegation was respectful and deferential. They knew they were taking a risk, even requesting the meeting. Thomas Heathcote spoke first. He explained that he'd been loyal to the company for over a decade. He'd built fine cars. He'd never complained. But his family was starving. He requested either wage increases back to 1893 levels or rent reductions proportional to the wage cuts. He emphasized that workers were willing to accept temporary hardship if there was a path forward. They understood the depression was real. They just needed fairness. Jenny Curtis spoke next. She described watching her younger brother go to bed without dinner 3 nights the previous week. She described borrowing money from neighbors who had no money to lend. She described the humiliation of being refused additional credit at the company store. She looked directly at George Pullman and asked him whether he expected her family to starve or freeze. She could pay rent or buy food, but not both. Pullman refused both requests. He explained that wages reflected current market rates for labor. The Depression had reduced demand for rail cars, which reduced the value of labor. He was paying what the market would bear. Rent, he explained, reflected fair return on real estate investment. The houses had been built at specific costs. Maintaining them required specific expenses. Rent rates provided appropriate return on that investment. Wages and rents were separate business functions that couldn't be linked. To reduce rents because of reduced wages would be economically irrational. Thomas Heathcote pointed out that when the same company controlled both wages and housing costs, the separation was meaningless. If Pullman cut their wages but maintained their rents, the net effect was that workers were subsidizing the real estate operation with their labor. Pullman disagreed. He believed his economic logic was sound, and that workers should accept it. Rents on company housing had always been higher than comparable housing elsewhere. Workers had accepted those rents when times were good. They couldn't now demand special treatment because times were bad. The meeting accomplished nothing. Pullman made clear he would not negotiate. On May 11, 1994, 3,000 Pullman workers walked out. The strike was spontaneous, not planned by union leadership. Workers had reached the breaking point. They assembled outside the factory gates after the morning shift. Someone suggested a vote. Jenny Curtis spoke first. She described her brother's hunger. She described borrowing from neighbors. She was done asking permission to survive. Thomas Heathcote spoke next. He had been loyal for 12 years. He had built luxury for millionaires while his children wore clothes with holes. He was done waiting for fairness that would never come. The men voted by raising their hands. 3,000 hands went up. Their demands were simple: restore wages to 1893 levels, or reduce rents proportionally to wage cuts. They believed that public sympathy for starving workers living in company housing would pressure Pullman to negotiate. They underestimated his stubbornness. Pullman refused to negotiate with striking workers. He issued a statement saying he would rather close the entire factory permanently than submit to worker demands. He shut down the plant completely and waited for workers to submit. He believed they would break within days or weeks when they had no income at all. By the end of May, 4,400 workers were idle. The factory sat silent. No cars were being built. Revenue stopped entirely. But Pullman had vast wealth and could outlast workers who lived paycheck to paycheck. The strikers needed help. They needed support from organized labor with resources to sustain a prolonged strike. They reached out to the American Railway Union, a new organization founded in 1893 by Eugene Victor Debs. Debs was born in Terre Haute, Indiana, in 1855. He'd worked as a railroad fireman before becoming a labor organizer. The ARU was different from traditional craft unions that organized workers by specific skills. The Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers organized engineers. The Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen organized firemen. Each craft union protected its own members, but often competed with other unions. The ARU organized all railroad workers regardless of skill level or job classification. Engineers, firemen, brakemen, switchmen, track workers, carmen, everyone who worked for railroads could join. The ARU's membership had grown to 150,000 within a year, making it one of the largest labor organizations in America. The union had recently won a strike against the Great Northern Railway, forcing the company to restore wage cuts. That victory had emboldened the union and demonstrated that coordinated action by all railroad workers could defeat even the most powerful railroad companies. DBS initially urged caution when Pullman workers requested help. He understood that striking against Pullman meant confronting not just one company, but the entire railroad industry. Pullman cars operated on 24 different railroads across the country. A boycott of Pullman cars would disrupt service on all those railroads simultaneously. But ARU delegates who visited Pullman in June were shocked by what they saw. They met Jenny Curtis and heard about children going hungry. They met Thomas Heathcote and heard about 12 years of loyalty rewarded with starvation wages. Workers and their families were literally starving while living in well-maintained houses. Children were malnourished. Mothers were sick from inadequate food. The contrast between the town's beautiful architecture and the human suffering inside those buildings convinced delegates that action was necessary. At the ARU convention in Chicago on June 21st, delegates voted to demand that Pullman submit to arbitration. If Pullman refused, the ARU would boycott all trains pulling Pullman cars. Pullman refused arbitration. He stated that there was nothing to arbitrate. Wages and rents were set according to economic principles. Workers could accept them or seek employment elsewhere. On June 26, 1894, the ARU declared a boycott. Union members would refuse to handle any train pulling Pullman cars. Railroads faced a choice. They could detach Pullman cars from their trains and operate without them, or they could insist on pulling Pullman cars and face strikes by their entire workforce. Most railroads chose to fight. They were members of the General Managers Association, an organization representing 24 railroads operating out of Chicago. The GMA had been formed to coordinate responses to labor actions. Its members controlled railroad networks stretching across the western United States. They viewed the ARU boycott as an existential threat. If workers could successfully boycott one manufacturer's cars, they could boycott anything. The power of railroad management would be broken. Within days of the boycott declaration, 125,000 railroad workers had joined the action. ARU members walked off the job when railroads attempted to attach Pullman cars to trains. Non-union workers often joined them in sympathy. Rail traffic west of Chicago ground to a halt. Trains sat on sidings. Mail stopped moving. Freight shipments were delayed indefinitely. Passenger service collapsed. The boycott was the most effective labor action in American history to that point. It demonstrated that coordinated action by industrial workers could paralyze the national economy. But the railroads had powerful allies. They had relationships with politicians at every level of government. They had lawyers who could obtain court orders. They had money to hire replacement workers and private security forces. Most importantly, they had access to the President of the United States. Railroad companies formed the General Managers Association to coordinate their counterattack. They hired thousands of replacement workers, many of them desperate men willing to cross picket lines for any wage. They attached Pullman cars to mail trains, knowing that federal law made interfering with mail delivery a crime. If strikers stopped mail trains, they'd be violating federal law rather than just engaging in a labor dispute. It was a deliberate strategy to transform a labor issue into a federal crime. The railroads pressured President Grover Cleveland to intervene. Cleveland was sympathetic to business interests and hostile to labor activism. His administration represented the interests of industrialists and financiers, not workers. His Attorney General, Richard Olney, was particularly hostile to the strike. Olney had been a lawyer for railroad companies before joining the government. He still owned railroad stock. His entire career had been built on serving corporate interests. He saw the Pullman strike as a dangerous precedent that threatened the established economic order. On July 2, 1894, Olney obtained a federal injunction from a federal court in Chicago. The injunction prohibited Eugene Debs and other ARU leaders from interfering with mail trains or interstate commerce. The legal theory was that the strike constituted a conspiracy in restraint of trade under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The act had been passed in 1890 to prevent corporate monopolies, but Olney was using it against workers. The injunction ordered strikers to allow trains to operate or face arrest for contempt of court. Debs and the ARU leadership ignored the injunction. They believed they had the right to strike and that federal courts had no authority to prohibit peaceful labor action. The strike continued. On July 4, 1894, President Cleveland sent federal troops to Chicago without requesting permission from Illinois Governor John Peter Altgeld. This was unprecedented. Governors typically had to request federal military intervention during civil disturbances. Cleveland dispatched troops on his own authority, claiming that protecting mail delivery and interstate commerce justified federal action. 20,000 soldiers and federal marshals occupied Chicago. Their orders were to break the strike by any means necessary and ensure trains operated whether workers agreed or not. Violence erupted immediately. Federal troops clashed with strikers and crowds of sympathizers who gathered at rail yards. The presence of troops inflamed tensions rather than calming them. Workers who had been conducting a peaceful boycott became enraged at military occupation of their city. Buildings burned, rail cars were overturned and set on fire. Shooting broke out between troops and crowds. The exact sequence of events was disputed, but the results were clear. Over a dozen people died in Chicago in early July. More were killed as strikes spread to 27 states from Illinois to California. In Sacramento, California, federal troops fired into a crowd, killing 4. In Trinidad, Colorado, deputies killed 6 strikers. In Hammond, Indiana, soldiers bayoneted a crowd trying to block trains. The total death toll exceeded 30, though exact numbers were never established because many deaths went unreported. Thousands were injured. Property damage approached $80 million, approximately $2.4 billion in modern money. Railroad cars burned, stations were damaged, tracks were torn up. The violence was the worst industrial conflict America had yet seen. The federal intervention crushed the strike. Troops forced trains to run at gunpoint. Replacement workers took over operations under military protection. By mid-July, rail traffic was resuming on most lines. Strikers couldn't compete with federal military power. On July 10th, federal marshals arrested Eugene Debs and other ARU leaders for violating the injunction. Debs was charged with contempt of court and conspiracy. He was convicted and sentenced to 6 months in prison. The conviction was upheld by the Supreme Court in 1995 in a decision called In re Debs. The Supreme Court ruling established that federal courts could issue injunctions against strikes that interfered with interstate commerce, and that violating those injunctions was punishable as contempt. The precedent gave federal courts and the executive branch enormous power to suppress labor activity. For the next 40 years, federal injunctions would be the primary tool used to break strikes. Workers would face imprisonment for participating in labor actions that courts deemed illegal. The Pullman strike had failed, and its failure had strengthened the legal weapons available to corporations and government against organized labor. Workers returned to Pullman's factory in August 1994. They had gained nothing. Wages remained at Depression levels. Rents remained at pre-Depression levels. The mathematics that had driven them to strike remained unchanged. Thomas Heathcote was not among those rehired. He had been on the delegation that met with Pullman. He had spoken at strike meetings. His name appeared on a list. He applied at every factory in Chicago. Railroad companies shared information about agitators. No one would hire him. He moved his family to Milwaukee and found work as a general laborer, earning $1 daily, half his previous wage. His wife Margaret took in laundry to supplement their income. The house in Milwaukee had no running water and no gas lighting. After 12 years in Pullman's paradise, they were living in exactly the kind of housing the company town was supposed to make obsolete. Jenny Curtis was rehired, but only because skilled seamstresses were hard to replace. She returned to her sewing machine in the upholstery department. Supervisors watched her constantly. She could not speak to other workers without being reported. She could not attend meetings. She could not organize. If she complained about anything, she would be fired. She lasted 18 months before she could not stand it any longer. She left Pullman in 1896 and moved to Boston to work in a textile mill. The wages were lower, but at least she did not live in a prison disguised as paradise. Many workers who had been prominent in the strike found they were no longer needed. The company refused to rehire known agitators. Those workers were blacklisted throughout the railroad industry. They could not find work anywhere. Some left Chicago entirely. Others took jobs outside railroads for lower wages. Families that had lived in Pullman for years were forced to leave. The workers who returned found conditions worse than before. Management was hostile and suspicious. Foremen watched for any sign of union sympathy. Workers who complained about anything faced immediate firing. The company had won completely and intended to ensure workers understood their powerlessness. Production resumed, but at lower levels than before the Depression. Orders remained scarce. Many workers got only part-time hours. The factory that had employed 12,500 in 1893 employed fewer than 8,000 by 1895. But Pullman's victory came at enormous cost to his reputation. National opinion had turned against him. Newspapers across the country published stories about workers receiving paychecks for pennies, while Pullman maintained 8% dividends. Ministers preached sermons condemning Pullman's greed and lack of Christian charity. Reform organizations criticized the company town model as feudalism dressed in brick and indoor plumbing. Even some business leaders questioned whether Pullman's approach had been wise. The violence and federal military intervention had frightened the entire industrial class. If labor disputes required deploying the army, something was fundamental wrong. The Illinois state government launched an investigation. The federal government appointed a commission to investigate the causes of the strike. The United States Strike Commission was led by Carroll D. Wright, the Commissioner of Labor. The commission held hearings through the summer and fall of 1894. They interviewed workers, company officials, railroad executives, and labor leaders. They examined company financial records. They inspected the town of Pullman. Jenny Curtis testified before the commission. She described her family's starvation. She showed her pay stubs. She explained how the company's system made it impossible to survive. The commission issued its report in November 1894. The findings were devastating to Pullman. The commission concluded that the company's refusal to reduce rents while cutting wages had been unjust and had created the conditions that made the strike inevitable. Workers had been driven to desperation by economic policies that prioritized company profits over human welfare. The commission criticized Pullman's paternalism as fundamentally UN American. The report stated that workers should not be forced to live in company-owned housing or shop at company stores as conditions of employment. The dependency created by total company control was incompatible with American principles of individual liberty and self-governance. The commission recommended that the Pullman Palace Car Company sell the town's residential properties to the workers or to independent buyers. Workers should be able to own their homes or rent from landlords who didn't also control their employment. The separation of housing from employment was necessary to prevent the kind of exploitation that had occurred. The report also recommended legislation to enable voluntary arbitration of labor disputes and to protect workers' rights to organize. Not all recommendations were implemented, but the report's moral condemnation of Pullman was clear and widely publicized. Pullman refused to accept the commission's findings. He issued statements defending his town as a benevolent experiment in industrial welfare. He insisted workers were ungrateful and had been manipulated by outside agitators. Rents were fair returns on investment. Wages reflected market conditions. The strike had been caused by radical labor organizers, not by company policies. Pullman maintained this position publicly until his death, but privately, the criticism affected him deeply. Legal pressure mounted through 1895 and 1896. Reform groups lobbied state legislators. Newspapers continued publishing critical stories. The Illinois Attorney General filed suit in 1898 arguing that the Pullman Palace Car Company's corporate charter didn't authorize real estate operations unrelated to manufacturing rail cars. The company had been chartered to build railroad equipment. Operating a town with residential housing, retail stores, utilities, and a hotel exceeded that charter. The state argued that this unauthorized activity was illegal and must cease. The case reached the Illinois Supreme Court. In a landmark decision, the court agreed with the state's position. The ruling stated that corporations could only engage in activities explicitly authorized by their charters. The Pullman Company's charter authorized manufacturing. It didn't authorize operating a town. The court ordered Pullman to divest all property not directly needed for railcar production within a reasonable time frame. The company had to sell the houses, stores, hotel, utilities, parks, everything that made Pullman a company town, rather than simply a factory with adjacent housing. The ruling effectively ended the model of total corporate control over workers' lives. Other companies operating similar towns took note. If Illinois courts would dismantle Pullman's town, they might dismantle others. The precedent influenced how American businesses interacted with workers for decades. Companies could build housing for workers, but they couldn't make living in that housing a condition of employment. They couldn't control every aspect of workers' existence outside the factory. George Pullman didn't live to see his town dismantled. He died in October 1897 at his mansion on Prairie Avenue in Chicago. He was 66 years old. Doctors listed the cause as a heart attack. Those close to Pullman knew he'd been broken by the strike and its aftermath. The man who believed he could solve the labor problem through architectural perfection had instead sparked a national crisis that required federal troops to suppress. His model town had become a symbol of corporate oppression. His name, once associated with luxury and innovation, was now linked to greed and exploitation. Newspaper obituaries were respectful but noted the controversy. Pullman died as one of the wealthiest men in America, but also as one of the most hated by working people. The family feared revenge even in death. Workers' hatred of Pullman was intense and personal. The family worried about grave robbers or vandals seeking to desecrate his corpse. They took extraordinary precautions. Pullman was buried in Graceland Cemetery in Chicago's uptown neighborhood. The funeral was small and private. After mourners left, workers began modifications to the grave. They dug the pit deeper than normal. They lined it with layers of tar paper and asphalt to waterproof it. They placed Pullman's casket inside and encased it in a block of reinforced concrete. Steel rails, the same type his cars had run on, were embedded in the concrete for additional strength. The concrete block was lowered into the pit. More concrete was poured on top. Then layers of steel rails, then more concrete. The grave was filled with tons of concrete and steel, creating one of the most fortified burial sites in America. It stands as testament to how deeply workers despised the man who'd claimed to be their benefactor. The Pullman Palace Car Company began selling the town's residential and commercial properties in 1898. The process took years. By 1907, the divestiture was complete. Workers and outside investors purchased the houses. The stores were sold to independent operators. The utilities were acquired by the city. The town of Pullman was incorporated as a regular municipality with elected government in 1907. The Pullman Company continued operating for decades after George Pullman's death and after the forced sale of the town. Pullman cars remained the standard for luxury rail travel through the 1950s. The company pioneered innovations, including all-room sleeping cars with no open sections, streamlined lightweight cars for high-speed trains, and air-conditioned coaches. But labor relations remained contentious for decades. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, organized by A. Philip Randolph in 1925, fought for 12 years to win recognition. Robert Turner, if he'd lived, would have been 69 years old when the union was recognized in 1937. He died in 1921 of tuberculosis contracted from years of sleeping in unventilated porter quarters and working in all weather conditions. He was 55 years old. His lungs had been damaged by decades of breathing coal smoke and sleeping in damp, poorly ventilated spaces. He left a wife and 3 children. His son, Robert Turner, Jr., became a Pullman porter in 1928. He inherited his father's route, the Chicago to New York run. But he also inherited his father's determination that things could be better. He joined the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and attended organizing meetings despite the risk of being fired. He testified before Congress in 1935 about working conditions. He described his father's 18-hour shifts for 90 cents. He described sleeping in porter quarters that bred disease. He described the racist treatment that was considered normal. His testimony helped pass the Railway Labor Act that forced companies to negotiate with unions. When the union was officially recognized in 1937, Robert Turner, Jr. was there. He was 32 years old. 43 years after the Pullman strike, 40 years after his father had started working the Chicago to New York run, the company finally had to negotiate with the men who made its luxury service possible. The union contract established 8-hour shifts, minimum wages that didn't depend on tips, paid time off, and health benefits. Robert Turner, Jr. earned a living wage for the same work his father had done for pennies. The company resisted unionization fiercely, using the same tactics George Pullman had employed: firing organizers, blacklisting union supporters, threatening workers with job loss. The Wagner Act of 1935 forced the company to negotiate. The union was officially recognized in 1937, 43 years after the Pullman strike. By the 1960s, airline travel had made long-distance train travel obsolete. Sleeping cars couldn't compete with flights that covered in hours what trains required days to traverse. Pullman stopped manufacturing passenger cars in 1981, more than a century after George Pullman built his first luxury sleeper. The company name survived through mergers and acquisitions, but the original business model was dead. The town of Pullman still exists as a neighborhood on Chicago's far south side. It's now called the Pullman Historic District. Many of the original brick row houses remain privately owned and occupied by families who have no connection to the Pullman Company. The house on Fulton Street where Thomas Heathcote lived with his family is still there. It's been renovated multiple times. The current owners have no idea that a Scottish carpenter once calculated his paycheck deductions at the kitchen table, watching his net pay shrink month after month until he had nothing left. The Hotel Florence was restored and operates as a museum and event space. The Arcade Building burned in 1926 and was never rebuilt. The factory complex was demolished in the 1920s. Empty lots mark where the erecting shop once stood. Walking through the neighborhood today, you can see the architectural vision George Pullman imposed: the neat rows of red brick houses, the planned streets, the remnants of Victorian-era grandeur. But you can also see what that vision cost. The strike that began in Pullman spread across 27 states and involved 250,000 workers. It led directly to federal intervention that established legal precedents used for 40 years to suppress labor organizing. The Supreme Court decision in re Debs gave federal courts power to issue injunctions against strikes. The precedent wouldn't be overturned until the Norris-LaGuardia Act of 1932 limited federal courts' ability to interfere with labor disputes. The Illinois Supreme Court, ruling that corporations couldn't operate company towns, influenced corporate law throughout the 20th century. But the deeper question Pullman raised has never been fully resolved. What are the limits of corporate power over workers' lives? Modern corporations don't literally own the houses workers live in, but they exercise control in different ways. They provide health care that ties workers to jobs. They offer stock options that vest over years. They create campus environments where workers spend most of their waking hours. They track productivity through electronic surveillance. The mechanisms differ from Pullman's direct ownership, but the underlying dynamic remains. How much of a worker's life can be claimed in exchange for employment? George Pullman thought he had the answer. He built a town to prove it. Thomas Heathcote and Jenny Curtis and thousands of workers burned rail cars and fought federal troops rather than accept that answer. Robert Turner spent 18-hour shifts making luxury possible for people who called him George. His son fought for 12 years to win the dignity his father never had. The strike failed in its immediate goals, but it succeeded in destroying the legitimacy of Pullman's model. The sleeping cars are gone. The company town has been absorbed into Chicago. What remains is the question he thought he'd solved, but actually made more urgent. Who owns a worker's life?